Now let's look at the shift of the AD and AS model on the graph. Okay, we're going to consider four different cases. The first case is there is a fall in the confidence of consumers and investors. Okay, and we know that when consumers are less confident, they're going to cut their consumption. When investors are less confident about the future's economy, then they're going to reduce their investment, right? So both would lead to a decrease in aggregate demand, all right? So let's put this on the graph. Now we're going to start with the unique place here when the short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and the aggregate demand, all three curves cross the same point. In other words, as we said before, the E bar here means the short run equilibrium and long run equilibrium. They're overlapping here. Okay, and so you could say at the beginning, the economy produces at the potential level Y bar. Okay, so it's just on the long-term trend, and then this happens. The fall in the confidence of consumers and investors, as we said, which leads to a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so we find that the equilibrium moves from E bar to A here, right? And we find that's the new intersection between the AD prime and the SRAS. Okay, the short run aggregate supply curve doesn't change. Okay, now at point A, we find that the output level is YA, which is lower than Y bar. That means this economy is experiencing a contraction. Okay, it produces less than its potential. Okay, on the vertical axis, we find that the equilibrium price, the overall price (PA), lies below P bar. So there's a decrease in overall price level. That means we find a deflation in this economy. Okay, so in this case, it's a contraction plus a deflation. All right. Now the second case we're going to look at is a rise in the oil price. Okay, as we mentioned in the previous video, that the crude oil is super important for an industrialized economy. Okay, so when the oil price goes up, then it's more expensive to produce many goods and services. Okay, so the production cost would be higher, and the producers would be less incentive to produce. Okay, they're going to cut back their production. So the short run aggregate supply curve should shift to the left. Okay, again, we start with the E bar. Okay, that's a short run and long run equilibrium, and then we're going to shift the SRAS to the left. Okay, so that's this orange one you see, and we find a new intersection between the SRAS and the AD. So the aggregate demand doesn't change in this case. Okay? And then the market equilibrium is moving from E bar to point A, where we find once again the output level YA is below the potential level Y bar. Okay, so we find a contraction again, okay, in this economy. But the difference here, different from the previous case, is we find at point A, the overall price level is higher, okay, than P bar. So the economy experiences inflation. So this is a combination of contraction and inflation. Okay. Now when we put the two cases together, we find that both are contractions. Okay, but in the left hand side it's a deflation, but the right hand side is inflation. So here we're going to draw the first important conclusion, which is not all contractions are alike. Okay, and we believe this conclusion is very important because that helps us figure out what's really going on in this economy. Okay, suppose we don't have these graphs in front of us, and how are you gonna figure out what's going on out there? Okay, especially when we experience a recession. Okay, and in the public, the general public's opinion, then they would say, a recession means the output level decreases, so we produce less, and some people lose their jobs, right? Unemployment rate goes up. That's it. So they won't be able to tell the difference between these two cases. Okay, and we find that the identifying the difference between these two is super important because that gives us a clue, the difference in the causes. Okay, because on the left-hand side, it's a decrease in aggregate demand, and on the right-hand side, it's a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. Now, if the causes are different, later we're going to say, the solutions would be different as a result. Okay, so the economic policies we come up with to deal with these situations would be different. Okay, but once again, in the first place, we got to be able to figure out the difference. Okay, now let's consider two more cases. The third case is a rise in wealth. Okay, so households becomes wealthier. Okay, so of course they are gonna increase their consumption. Okay, so the aggregate demand curve should shift to the right in this case. Okay, now that's what you see here on the slide, and the equilibrium is moving from E bar to A. Okay, because of the rightward shift of AD. Now at point A, we find that the short-run output level YA is above Y bar. Okay, in other words, the economy produces more than its potential level. Okay, on the vertical axis, we find that the overall price level is higher than P bar. So there's an inflation. Okay, so in this case, we're saying that it's a combination between an expansion and inflation. All right. The fourth case, the last one, let's look at the fall in the oil price. Okay. Now, when the crude oil becomes cheaper, then the production cost of many goods and services decreases. Okay. So it's cheaper to make these goods and services, then the producers would definitely want to produce more. Okay, so here what's going to happen is there's a rightward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, and we find the new intersection between SRAS and AD. Okay, let's call it point A. At equilibrium point A, we find that the output level stays above the potential level, Y bar, but the price level is below the original level. Okay, in other words, this economy is experiencing an expansion and deflation. Okay, because the overall price level is lower. Okay. Now, putting these two cases together, we can draw the second important conclusion, which is not all expansions are alike. Okay, once again, on your left-hand side, the output level goes up, so we produce more, we hire more people, right? But that's because of the increasing aggregate demand. In the right-hand side case, we find that we produce more because of the increase in short-run aggregate supply. Okay. Now here we're going to say that there are two types of the shocks. Okay, demand shock versus supply shock. So demand shock means the aggregate demand curve has been affected, has been shifting. Okay, the supply shock means the aggregate supply changes. Okay. Here, shocks means the exogenous events that shift the curves. So in the four cases we just discussed, these could be called the four shocks. Okay, for example, when somehow consumers and investors becomes more optimistic. Okay, so this could be driven by something else, not explained in the model. That's why we call it exogenous. Okay, it comes from outside of the model. All right. And once again, we would like to emphasize the importance of identifying a shock. Okay, it's just like when we go and see the doctor. For example, we get a fever. Okay, we don't feel pretty well. We go see the doctor, and the doctor will collect all kinds of the information from us, right? Like our weight, our body temperature, right? What kind of medicines we're taking. So they need all of this information to, figure what could be the cause of the my sickness. Okay, and economists, especially macroeconomists, working with the policymakers, need to do the same thing. We need to collect a lot of information to make our judgment. This is a demand shock or supply shock. Okay. And as we said before, we will come up with a corresponding policy to address these shocks. Okay. Now, here is a simplified version of how to identify a shock. Okay. So, for example, when we look at the output, then we would have a pretty good sense of this is an expansion or a contraction, right? We just look at the real GDP growth, and we can draw that conclusion. And for inflation, deflation, we need to look at the overall price indicator. Okay, so we have the GDP deflator or CPI, right? We can look at. Now here, if we look at the real GDP growth rate, so the vertical axis is a percentage change from a year ago. So this is the annual growth rate, okay? And the horizontal axis is just quarter, because the GDP, we have quarterly data, okay? Now we're pulling out, from the first quarter of 2018 all the way to the third quarter of 2020, okay? As you can say that, because of the pandemic, so the GDP growth rate has been negative in the past 3 quarters. Okay, that means our economy shrunk because of the pandemic. Okay, and of course you could say this is a contraction. Okay, but remember what causes the contraction? Is that the demand shock or supply shock? We also need to look at the overall price level, right? So here, what I'm pulling out is a CPI, Consumer Price Index, for all urban consumers, all items less food and energy. In other words, we're looking at the core CPI. Okay? So we find that the core CPI during the pandemic decreased a lot, okay, from approximately 2.4% every year to the lowest level during the pandemic is 1.2%. Okay? In other words, the overall price level is not, it's actually becomes lower, right? And so we could say, the current pandemic is a contraction and deflation. Okay. Now here, we probably need to be a little bit more careful because it's actually not really a deflation. It's just the growth of the overall price level declines, not as fast as pre-pandemic level.